All right. It says that we are live. I haven't been live on my own here in a while, so I'm kind of an amateur here, feeling like I'm an amateur again. I've got Jason, Cards and Comics, joining me. I was thinking about bringing you on, Jason, but then it was kind of like, you know what? Let's just go on together, and we're just going to do this thing.
All
So
right,
how are
let's
you
go. Let's do this.
doing? How was your week?
It's good. I traveled to Indiana for work, got caught in a rainstorm, and had to take a train all the way back from DC to Albany. So trains, are not as fun from a time perspective, but we got home, and now I'm ready for the weekend for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's start with, I guess let's just kind of go through your hobby history first.
Sure.
While it's kind of like what we should do. I've been talking with you off and on for a while now, kind of offline. This is the first live that
Hmm.
I've done with you, but talk to me about kind of how you got into cards, comics, collectibles in general. How did it all start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, for cards itself, I was really just collecting with friends in the 80s. Like 86 was my first year I really remember collecting. And, I stayed away from that stupid 86 Fleer basketball set, just collected Topps baseball and Fleer, or sorry, Topps, football. And so that was fun. And then my dad, who was a big Cardinals collector, and when he was a kid and a Cardinals fan, saw me collecting cards. And then I read a magazine it's called Sports Card Magazine, and it said, because I didn't really know how to collect. I didn't like what should I collect? Should I do sets? So and I read this magazine. It said, if you have a favorite team, collect teams of the years that they win the World Series or have some special year. And I thought, okay, well, what years? I'm a Pirates fan. You can see the hat. What years did the Pirates win the World Series? I'll collect that year. Then I realized, well, the year after they have World Series cards and specialty cards that commemorate the year. So I collected the year after. So I went to a card show that my mom surprised me. So it's one of those cool things. I was a kid. My mom took me to the mall, which I'm like, I don't want to go to the mall. She's like, yeah, you got to come. And then she took me to a card show, first one ever. Surprised me. And at that show, I picked up 4 or 5 61 Pirates, which is the first team I was going to collect, which commemorates the 60 Pirate World Series win. And I took those home, and my dad looked at them, and he was like, these are cool. And from then on, he actually started buying me cards. He would go on his lunch break and buy packs or buy cards for me, and we would collect together. And he would collect Cardinals, I collect Pirates. And if you saw the video I did about my, how I, started the hobby, I still have that 61 Pirate team set I collected when I was in high school with
And it
my
was
dad.
Clemente. It was Clemente, right? That you were
Yeah,
chasing. Yeah.
Clemente was my really last big card, but there's
Was
some
your dad
short
a big
prints.
Barry Larkin guy
Um, you know, Not a Barry Larkin guy.
or
He
Bob
was,
Gibson?
yeah,
I'm not
Bob
as much a
Gibson,
baseball
Stan
guy.
Usual, Lou Brock were his guys.
Yeah, Lou Brock. Okay. Yep.
So that's really where he was. And the 68, 60 or the 60, 67 Cardinal team was kind of like when he was really, into it as a kid. So that was, Bob Gibson had that, amazing year. The next year they got beat by the Red Sox. So yeah, it's really how I started. And comic books is a little different. I collected comic books as a kid. I just was a Spider-Man reader. Then around 2009, 2010, I was setting up as a dealer at a Indiana convention center show, and it was dual comics and cards. And so it was a slow show, and I just walked around the show, and I picked up a bunch of amazing Spider-Man comic books at the show, just kind of just messing around. And I got really interested in it. I started going to comic book stores and buying the new issues, and that really got me into just reading comic books again. I wasn't really collecting them because I was just like, I don't really know what I want to do with these. Then I saw that there was graded comic books, and so I'd already had crossed over into graded cards. I saw graded comic books. I'm like, wow, that's like such a parallel for me. And then the first thing they said was, well, I'm going to collect the first 300 issues of Spider-Man, like goal.
Wow.
So that was like my first goal for comic books. And then I've morphed over time with comics. Right now I still am collecting Spider-Man, but I've morphed into some other areas. I really like Alex Schomburg and Golden Age comic books, LB Cole. So I have those. In fact, you see those on the wall behind me. Those are my Alex Schomburg books. And then, I'm from Oklahoma originally, and my mother is she's Cherokee, and so my grandmother was full blood Cherokee. So I collected Native American cards and comic books. So you'll see on sometimes I'll show Chief Bender, You'll see like Native American cover comic books,
Hmm.
like modern characters like Echo, Danny Moonstar. I collect those characters in comics and then cards. So I do those cards as well. So it's just like a private collection, something I don't show very often because it's sort of a personal collection, but that gets me interested. So the Spider-Man books and things like that have gone down. But one thing, I'm also as a dealer, so I do set up at shows. So I have a separate set of stuff I have to go to shows with. That's not what I consider personal collection. I consider that more. I don't consider investing books. It's just stuff I know I can take to a show and sell, or have
Yeah.
ability to trade and move around. So that's always something I've done. I've set up at shows probably for the last 15, 20 years. So I don't consider myself a dealer. I consider myself a collector that sets up at shows to move inventory to buy more PC stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, like the exciting comics and some of those golden age comic books that might not have the same sort of, notoriety as, old DC or, like Superman Golden
Yeah.
Age or something like that. Is that more, do you feel, I mean, I guess, do you have those as, obviously there's a PC element where it's just kind of a fun thing to collect, but do you see those as something like, I think that these are going to really appreciate over time based on certain historical elements or,
Sure. Well, I mean, for Alex Schomburg, Startling Comics 42, I believe, or 49, I get it mixed up, was one of the most expensive non superhero comic books ever made. It's the
Hmm.
one that shows it looks like Bender from Futurama
Oh
carrying
yeah.
a female. That's a very iconic cover. Again, that's not a superhero Marvel comic. It's a Startling Comics, and but it's a very cool cover, and that just shows like that's an Alex Schomburg cover. I do feel like they're comics that they're expensive, but they're not as expensive as a timely Captain America book. Now, Alex Schomburg did do Captain America books, and the way I've got myself positioned, you can't see him, but further down the line, I do have Captain America, Flash, USA Comics that have Schomburg covers. Like I have Captain America 27, which is the motorcycle cover that's pretty famous for Schomburg. So that I feel like those books are almost like they're so rare now, they don't sell like maybe once or twice a year now. They're like Babe Ruth in some cases, those
Yeah.
kind of cards that those are so hard to find in good condition that just finding them is becoming a challenge, let alone what the prices are. I don't know what I have, probably the third highest in the census on that 27. I
Mm.
don't know. I bought it for $6,000 probably 7 years ago.
Oh
um,
wow.
I don't know what it'd sell for today, but I think it did appreciate a lot of money. I had a dealer offer me 15 for it, and I'm not going to sell it, but it just shows that these golden age books do appreciate, but they do sometimes they go down. The horror comics did go down in value the last couple of years as they went way up in value and down. So you have to be careful. Every market has its own peaks and valleys. I think right now, golden age books are kind of stable and flat. They haven't really spiked like some of these modern books did during the run up in 2020.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. And I want to actually hold that thought. I want to go back to some of the golden age stuff. Let's say hello to some of the people in the chat. We've got Ryan McClanahan. Good to see you, buddy. Actually excited to see you at the National as well here. And we're only like a month away now. It's crazy. 5 weeks or something. It's coming up.
It's coming up.
Rocco Rosado, good to see you. Summer night chatting cards, comics, and collectibles. Appreciate it, guys. I took my kids to the pool, had a few drinks, and now I'm drinking coffee to just kind of come back off of it a little bit. So bear with me. Hoff Van Dam, all the way from New Zealand, from Kiwi Land. Brian Sherland took a break from buying gold bullion, and he is here tonight. 108 degrees today. Wow. Go Bucks. Buzzy, I'm going to bring it up, even though it's a hater troll. Buzzy, Dustin the sports card imposter. He's always here every week with something. Collects usually attention, not cards. I think the
Hey,
thousands of cards that I've got would disagree with you, Buzzy, but I'm sure you've got
hey,
incredible.
you got your own stalker. That shows you made it.
Yeah. Hey, you have to be doing something right to have people making special videos or whatever. I've got all sorts of weirdness out there. Philly Joe, good to see you. Bob Boozle, Doug Drayback super fan.
I have some really fun Doug Drabeck cards. My favorite Doug Drabeck card is his Desert Shield card. So
Oh, nice. Michael Ham, what's going on, man? Hope all is well down in Tampa. And I hope that you're going to the National. Maybe. I think you were kind of on the fence. Hopefully, Flipping Steve is you're winning Flipping Steve's event that he's got his national contest. I hope that you win. NH Rocker 2009. Good to see you. All right. Okay. So you are a longtime collector. You are not people. I swear, people that got back into the hobby over the last year, 2 years, they get all sorts of grief just for the fact that they're getting back into it. I got back in 2018, so I'm still somewhat of a newbie getting back in, but I was definitely a big time collector going back to my childhood. What made you decide to go the YouTube route? I mean, you're a collector. Obviously, you have a lot of collecting knowledge, a lot of just individual, probably product set knowledge, whether it be cards or comics. But what made you say, you know what, let's do the YouTube thing?
Yeah, it was an event. I lived in Indiana for a long time. I moved for work purposes. And in Indiana, I had a whole network of people I was setting up with as a dealer. I would go to special cards like the Midwest, the last that Midwest show that just happened. The promoter of that show was the person I set up with every month. His show, JJ All Star, with my buddy Russ, and we would sit next to each other every month, talk cards. We went to the National together. We went to the Chicago Sports Fest together, and I moved to New York, and I lost that whole community. So I was kind of bummed because being up here, no friends, in the area. All my collecting friends were at home in Indiana. I thought, well, I saw these YouTube channels popping up, and I thought, well, maybe I could create a separate community online. And because I was really busy with work, I went back and got my master's degree in international food law. So I was really busy, so I thought maybe an online presence would help because I was so busy at work and doing the law school thing that this could be a way I could still be communicating with people about cards and comics and things I love collecting without having to be physically present. And then with COVID, that obviously became even more important to not be physically and with people because you just couldn't. So all those factors were put together, but my biggest reason was to try to find a new community, to find people to really connect with and talk about things like cards and comics, because it's how I get away from things. Like I said, I have a pretty stressful job, and the things I deal with on the daily basis are kind of heavy. So, to go home, to go to the man cave, play with comics, pick cards up in their boxes and go back and look at stuff I collected, when I was a kid, kind of de-stresses me. I also play guitar, so I don't, maybe you saw me play it on a video or two. And I also come down and play guitar. And so it's just a way for me to relax. And to me, it should be, this whole thing should be about having fun and communicating with other people and sharing experiences. It's not about, making money. I've never once thought that, this is about my career or how I'm going to become an influencer or make money at this. It's always been about, growing my collection and having fun with other people.
And how has that been? I mean, as far as, have you had viewers reach out to you? Have you made kind of new friends, along the way, or people just reconnected like, oh, cool, you're doing YouTube that you already knew, and that that kind of keep up with you that way?
Yeah, it's been hit or miss. I mean, honestly, I was very naive at the first. I thought, like things would just, go fast. And my channel's really grown, I think kind of slowly, in terms of just viewership. But I have made great connections. The people like, Neo, Flip and Steve, you have reached out, and I've had conversations with even with a little bit with Jeff, so there has been communication with individual collectors in the Albany area where I live. Has been great. They sometimes see my channel, and so when they see me at a show setting up, it does create a lot of interest in just what I do and how I go about things, and I have a channel they can go watch, and that makes selling and dealing a lot more interesting. And so I think it's done some of that. I will say that it's been a comic book side of it's been a little rough. I think the communities there haven't been as welcoming to like reaching out and having conversations. I feel like the comic book investor, his channel has been the only channel I really feel like he embraces conversation to a high level. I've had a few negative interactions with a few comic book channels, and I felt like that was disappointing because I was, again, I'm not trying to do anything but talk about the comics or things like that, but it felt more hard to break into those those communities than it was sports cards. I felt sports cards a little bit more welcoming than the comic book community, honestly. And maybe it's just because, you know, having a channel that does two things, you know, cards and comics, you kind of do alienate part of your viewership no matter what. And I think that's one of the reasons why my channel probably didn't grow quite as fast at the beginning, is just, you know, if I don't like cards or I don't like comics, it's like, I'm not going to watch your channel because, you know, half of what you do, I don't care for.
I'll be honest too. I'm kind of surprised that there's not kind of a Jeff Wilson on the comic book side. I haven't really found anything quite like that, because I agree with you. Because I tried to do a little bit of both in the beginning, where I was like, I like talking about collectibles in general, starting lineups. You know, I like talking about comic books or cards or whatever. And so, you know, I was looking at just comic book content, and there are some good channels out there, but there's not as much as I thought there would be. You know, talking about the business of it, you know, as far as buying and selling. I just don't really see a lot of it, and that kind of surprised me.
Yeah, I think on the comic book side, there are some really good channels like Reggie Collects and then Comic Book Investor. You know, those guys to me have really good content, and Reggie probably has the best, I think, you know, production values for what he does from a collector standpoint. But no one's gone all in. I think Reggie's, I think if you go to his channel a lot, you see he's doing a lot, like he's producing, I think, a comic book. He's doing a lot of things on his channel to get to that level. I just think Jeff had a lot more financial start than other people do, because if you look at what Jeff did, I mean, he has a studio for the most part. He's got employees to help him. I think a lot of these channels are do-it-yourselfers, and to get to that level really fast, it's going to be hard just to do it by yourself. Because even for me, you know, for me to edit a video and make a video, I'm doing it all by myself in my spare time. You know, between I challenge everyone to go look at a video and look at the timestamps on my channel. You'll see they're all like at 1 a.m, 2 a.m, because that's the time I have to do this. And it's just like, you have to like squeeze it into other things you do in your life, because, you know, this isn't a full-time gig for me and for most people on YouTube.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point. I mean, Jeff Wilson spent a lot of money to put that out in front, you know, and he's got a good business that he's running. So yeah, that makes sense. And there's not really anything comparable. I do see Knights of Old is talking about Comic Tom 101, I believe. Is that the name of the channel? It's Comic Tom.
Yeah, Comic Tom. Yeah, him and Russ and the people he have on his channel definitely have the highest production values. I always forget about Comic Tom, because I don't watch that channel as much as I used to, just because it's so much into the hot 50 or top 5. I mean,
it is
tons of top.
The thing that's really hilarious to me about on the comic book side too is just that you're talking about a lot of the same books. You know, like it's like the top 10 selling, but you can look at Key Collector or GoCollect.com, and you're really talking about the same Marvel books all the time. And then the same DC, and they're starting to get creative with minor keys, you know, and stuff. But
well, I have this weird theory that, you know, eventually every comic book will be a key or minor key at some point, because they'll find some panel or some character that may appear somewhere. It's just kind of like, you have to have every comic book now if you want to have every key and minor key at some point. But yeah, I mean, if you go to Key Collector, or if you go to Instagram and see what's posted there, you pretty much have the list that everyone else has every week. And sometimes Comic Tom has some good other content, but to me, it's so much interspersed with speculation and pricing videos that I'm just not as interested in that. I'd rather see, you know, Comic Collector Geek, I believe that's his name, that has a bunch of Golden Age, you know, reveals, or I'd just rather watch him open up boxes of Golden Age comics. That to me is more entertaining than the hot 5 comic books of the week.
Yeah, I watch more of Comic Tom just to see kind of his antics. It's more of the entertainment value than it is what they're even talking about, because he's got all the, you know, he does all the crazy voices or faces or whatever he's doing, and that's entertaining. What is something that you would like to see? Let's go. I know we're doing kind of cards and comics, but with it being like more of a card audience, I would think. And there's actually a couple of questions here for you. If you have questions for Jason, guys, throw them in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to those. What is something out of, I guess, card content that you feel like you would like to see more out of, or, you know, just anything on that front for yourself or for other channels, you know, how do you see evolving, that sort of thing?
For myself, you know, I've done a few videos where I'm trying to do a little bit more poking fun of the hobby and having more fun with kind of the tropes of the hobby. And I want to do more of that for me, because I feel like that's my, you know, I'm probably coming off as pretty bland right now, but that's my sense of humor. You know, I'm definitely someone who likes to poke fun at the tropes and what everyone says is the rules of the hobby, and how you're supposed to do things on YouTube and things like that. And I think that is what I'm going to try to do more of, and just not care about, like the view count, and just do what's fun for me. So that's me personally. For other folks, I do feel like I want people to like do more about what they love to collect and not care that it's going to gain a lot of views. I do feel like there is this sort of like hedge. Like, I'm not going to do this video because it's not going to generate enough views, so I'm just going to not do that. I do feel like you see that in some hobby. I call it playing it safe. We're all going to do the same videos because we know we're going to get a minimum amount of views if we do it that way. If, even for me personally, like I'm a huge pirate fan and a collector. I have more pirate cards than anything. And if you look at my channel, the only pirate cards I've ever shown is my Clemente collection. And I'm like, why haven't I shown my other pirate collection? Like, and it's because I'm already saying, like, in my head, well, no one was going to care. No one's going to care about my 91, Desert Shield set. No one's going to care about my Barry Bonds, 80s cards. No one's going to care about my 72 pirate team set. Like, I just feel like, that's in my head because I'm supposed to be showing like $5,000 LeBrons and Shields and Kabooms, and that's what everyone wants to see. And so I tricked myself into thinking that's what everyone wants. But now I'm like, well, I'm actually preparing a video right now on my pirate collection that's going to show a bunch of Josh Bell and failed pirate rookies, because that's what I collected, and show like, here's where I made a big mistake and collected a bunch of stuff. I'm probably going to go to the National and buy a bunch of O'Neill Cruz and make the same mistake again, because that's what we do as collectors. We keep doing the same things over and over.
At least with YouTube, though, the funny thing is, and you might have heard this too, they call it evergreen content. And then you have evergreen content that is something that picks up kind of views over time. Mm-hmm. And then you have more of the viral content where you're making something that's got like a headline that appeals to whatever the news is of the day, so you see kind of in card content or any content, you'll see either one of those, being kind of displayed. But it could just be that like that Pirates content, maybe on the front end, you don't get a lot of views, but like over time, mm-hmm. As people are searching for that sort of thing, you just pick them up over time. So it is kind of an interesting challenge, I think, for content creators, is because you can make certain videos that are still viable in 10 years. Or like when I do, or you do, or someone does like a news thing, the news of the day, that's not going to, like, people aren't going to care about that next week. So you're kind of playing that balancing act thing. Definitely. And then with YouTube, it's, with podcasts, it doesn't really work like that. People don't normally go back. If you look at podcast stats, they don't go back and watch past podcasts typically. Usually, it's kind of like, it just goes and goes and goes, unless it's like a Joe Rogan, where they interview, he interviewed Obama or he interviewed whoever, sure. And then that pops up in search or whatever. But so it's kind of an interesting ordeal, all of it. I don't know. And I guess it's just finding balance with it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it too is, if you really care about it or want to do it, then you should probably do it, because, I find when I do content that I really am truly interested in making, it's so much easier to produce the content when I'm forcing myself to do something just to do something. I feel like that's where I go like 6 days in between a video, because I feel like I'm just forcing myself to do something and, just to make content. And now I'd rather have an idea I care about to put something out there and have something I really want to talk about. But yeah, I mean, I think, some comments here in the YouTube about 90s undervalued players, I totally agree that the 90s side of card collecting, it's got so many players. Like, think of Tony Gwynn and Kirby Puckett in terms of autographs, right? Like on-card autographs from those guys should be worth a lot more. I mean, just let's face it, Tony Gwynn was amazing. George Brett, his cards. I know there's guys out there hoarding George Brett cards because he was just really great. The last guy who cleaned close to 400 along with Tony Gwynn. I just feel like over time, people are going to realize how just special some of those players were. Greg Maddux is another one. Like, those guys, Randy Johnson, it's just, their cards are so cheap. You can pick up the Tiffany Randy Johnson rookie right now for a couple $100. I'm probably in a 10, and that's just crazy considering how great he was as a player. I think that's where, if you want to find value in the hobby, and again, this is sort of why I talk about going to the National, is if you go to the National and you find that all the vintage stuff is overpriced and all the new stuff's overpriced, you might find some 90s underrated Hall of Famers you can pick up. And that's why I said, be open to kind of pivoting and trying to find something that's not priced heavy, something you can afford and still great to pick up, because, that is how I try to go to those shows, because you never know what you can find. And again, I've been picking up Barry Sanders cards now because I love Barry Sanders. His stuff
Love it.
is so cheap. It's just ridiculous. And compared to how good he was compared to, you could almost say that Barry Sanders at some point in time was the greatest football player that ever lived,
Yeah.
that was playing the game. And, it's hard to say that about any player out there, but you can say like Barry Sanders at one point was probably the best football player on the planet, and it could have been one of the best players ever.
Especially just because he played on a Lions team that was never any good. He never had a Pro Bowl line that he was running behind. I mean, it was literally a guy making something out of nothing every single game. It was wild to watch. Whereas if you look at other guys, of course, I can't, I didn't watch Jim Brown play, so I don't know what kind of line he had. But Emmitt Smith had a hell of a line for at least a decade watching them. I just remember thinking to myself as a kid, like, I could run through these holes. But anyway, I'm going to get all the Emmitt Smith people ticked off. All right, we're going to go back to the chat here. I'm going to go back up the list because there's a few questions I wanted to hit on. Bob Boozle says, you can't let him get away with mentioning international food law without asking him what kind of cases that involves. This could be like a rabbit hole. So why don't you maybe just pick out like just an example of, you don't have to give any specifics, but.
Well, I mean, I would just say in the news, because I'm not involved in this case, but if you think about the infant formula crisis that just happened, what I would be involved with is the regulatory side and prevention of that issue from happening in that facility. So that's what I would be in charge of, either preventing or dealing with the aftermath of that issue. So whatever happens from a regulatory side, which sometimes ends up in court, sometimes ends up in an FDA hands, that's where I would come in, and that's my area of expertise. So again, I'm not involved in that case, but those would be the kind of cases I would be involved in.
Interesting. Very interesting. Flippin' Steve, Denise O'Sullivan is my new favorite soccer player, and most people are not going to know who he's talking about. But when he was in Raleigh this past weekend, we went to an NC Courage game because my sister-in-law is the assistant coach there. So we were watching the game, and honestly, women's pro soccer is intense. We watched this game. We were lined up right where they were doing corner kicks. It was cool. But anyway, Flippin' Steve fell in love with Denise O'Sullivan. He's looking for cards. I think she's Irish. But anyway. So yeah, he has a new favorite soccer player. Bob Boozle, I appreciate it. Love Jason's 90s baseball content. Major crossover between the comic industry and the card hobby in the 40s through the early 70s. Absolutely. Appreciate creators that grow organically without the infusion of cash. Thank you, Bob. That's awesome. There was a question here. Oh yeah, question for Jason. Do you think the Marvel multiverse is leading up to an appearance from Mephisto?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because Mephisto is one of these guys that's a Deus Ex Machina, right? Like, he can do anything he wants and make things appear, disappear, go back. I mean, it's like that opens up a can of worms. Now, they've already done it a little bit, with the Loki series and brought time travel into it. So to me, that opens that can of worm. But if they bring Mephisto into it, are they going to bring, the worst, Spider-Man story of all time, with, resetting Peter Parker back to being single. And, I know he's not married in this universe, so that seems like something they would have to set up way in the future to do that story. So I don't know. I think how they want to bring him in, is they're going to bring him in with Silver Surfer, would be a question. I mean, he's got so many touch points in the Marvel U. But I think he's such a good character and they've been wanting to do the Ghost Rider, Son of Satan, all those characters, Werewolf by Night. I don't know. I think they got to figure out where he fits in. Is he going to be a magical monster? Is he going to be behind the scenes, string puller? Who knows? I think they have to figure out where he fits in, because he's done so much in the Marvel and been used in those different roles, that how's he going to fit in? So I think that's an interesting point. But I do love I do love his first appearance. So that's a great comic book.
Yeah, great cover as well. I love this one. What are general thoughts on original Spawn comics? Spawn was really my go-to comic when I was a kid. Image comics in general. Loved Image comics back in the early 90s. So I sold actually a Malibu Sun number 13. That's the first, I believe that's considered his first time on the page, the first time that, well, I think is there another book where he's on an advertisement or something? I can't remember. But anyway, Malibu Sun 13 is definitely, early book. That's kind of, it was an advertisement, basically stating that he was going to have his own series. Ended up selling that one when the comic boom happened, just because it got kind of ridiculous. I did the same thing with the Spawn 1 newsstand, where I'd gotten it a few years back, and then it tripled or something. I was just like, you know what? I'm going to sell it off. I do have just a regular copy of the 9/8, which is it's a very common book. I think it might be $100 or $150 or something like that. They sold like 5 million copies. So it's kind of like junk wax. It's like the Griffey Jr., 89 Upper Deck.
Yeah. $89, Griffey.
Yeah. $89. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, I love I love that whole series. I think I read through probably maybe like 60 or 70 issues, and then I was out of it. Now they've made like a zillion of them. But did you ever read Spawn, or were you ever into Image stuff?
Yeah. I mean, Spawn is a really interesting thing, because what happened was it went through the whole, comic bust period, kept going. And then by doing that, in the middle of this print run, in the hundreds and 150s to 250 issues, there's a ton of characters introductions that have little print runs with really good covers. And then there's also these variant covers that came out that are a little print run as well. And so if you go back and collect Spawn, and if you were a diligent Spawn hoarder, you probably have tons of comic books worth a lot of money now because of these little print runs. So you think about it, Spawn went from being sort of the most overprinted comic book of all time to having these little print runs with some key characters in them, and then there's some really cool characters, like the Gunslinger Spawn is a very cool character design. So I feel like, for people in that Spawn universe and people who really like the Spawn comics, they got rewarded because those are highly collectible now. And you see people trying to put those runs together, and they want those books, and some of them are low print. So I think for people who look at the entirety of the Spawn run, there's a lot of gems out there to go get if you're collecting that whole run.
Absolutely. I think you kind of answered Dwayne's question here, because I'm thinking about 90s Hall of Famers with like Randy Johnson and some of those guys, Maddox. There's just so many great players. Let's go back to Jason. People crack sports card slabs to resubmit because they feel the grade was incorrect or too low. Have you ever cracked a comic slab? That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the only time that, yes, so the answer is yes, but it's only if I feel like the comic book hadn't been cleaned or pressed. Then, I have cracked those, especially on some of the Silver Age books that were graded old grades, on old CGC slabs to try to get a bump in grade. And there's people out there who have whole businesses built on that.
I've seen that, yeah. Why do you think there's such a disconnect between that and like cards? Because if you had someone that was like cleaning and scrubbing on a card, everybody would flip out. So what's the deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, the cleaning and scrubbing on cards does happen. We just don't know about it. For example, we wipe Bowman Chrome cards with the cloth. That's a form of cleaning, right?
Sure.
With vintage, they're soaking, right? So you take a card, put it in water, you press it, you kind of like push it flat. And most people in the hobby don't consider soaking to be alteration, as long as you don't trim it afterwards. So that's the slippery slope of what people will accept and what they won't accept. I think the big touch point in cards versus comics is that comic books have always had the altered status on the books known for the most part. Now we know that CGC and PGX had the trimming issue, just like cards. But since they had these labeled books that were already altered, there was this idea in comics that, okay, well, their alterations are already caught and they're kind of labeled, so you feel more safe. In sports cards, there's nothing out there that's like allow alterations that are allowed, in terms of how they label them on the front of the sports card. If it's altered, for the most part, you can't get the card in a holder. That's sort of how PSA and SGC set the rules. So alterations immediately became the card's worthless because you can't even grade it. And I think that is where the differences in the hobby, those two hobbies really stand is in comic books, you can alter a comic book and still get it graded and get a number.
Yeah, it's just restored, right? It's just like the label.
And then in sports cards, if they think your card's been altered at all, it's not graded at all.
So really, it seems like it's more the grading companies that dictated that going back.
It did, and I think also because comic books are so much more brittle in terms of how they were manufactured, how many pages could be missing, the staples could fall out and rust away. That it was more common that people wanted the book preserved in some way because they're so hard to get, especially these golden age books. If you start with that set of collectors, they were like, well, the book needs to be preserved in some way, or else it's just going to fall apart and be gone. So it was accepted that yes, to keep this book around, we're going to have to do something. But in cards, there was just like, well, these cards are cards, and there's so many of them that exist. Unless the card is like super rare, like maybe the Wagner, alterations really shouldn't happen because we want the cards to be as they are, and that's how the grading company set it up. Of course, PSA with the first Wagner grade, I think they set some weird precedents with that card, how they treated it. But the idea was the idea around sports cards too, because I quit collecting vintage at one point because everything I was buying was either recolored or trimmed or not the grade that the dealer said it was. And
Now, is that
grading,
because you bought it raw and then you'd go to grade it and it would be weird?
well, not even before grading, I would buy it at the show and the guy would say, "This is near mint." I would get it home and find a crease. Or I'd
Oh,
find
okay, I
that
see.
it had coloring on the back. And I didn't see it at the show because terrible lighting at a show or whatever. And that just turned me off of those cards because I paid full price for this card, and I get it home and find it has a crease or it has something wrong with it, and the dealer kind of lied about it or didn't know it had a condition problem. PSA was there to fix those issues, to say, look, this card is truly near mint to mint. It's not been trimmed, it's not been altered, and sort of fix those hobby issues. And they made cards where you could sell them on platforms like eBay, and they kind of grew together at the same time. And so that really, I think, grew the sports card hobby a lot, was to be able to buy a card sight unseen and trust that you're going to get something that you're going to be happy with for the most part from a grade perspective. You can never do that with vintage sports cards before. You had to see the card physically in hand, or you would just get screwed. That was just how it was.
When did you see it turn? Because I remember just going back. So I was collecting like a lot of people. I probably stopped in 1995 when I was probably 14, I would say. And technically PSA was around. They started
Mm-hmm.
what, 91, 92. I don't remember ever seeing a graded card in
Mm-hmm.
1995.
Right.
And then I got back in 2018. But
Mm-hmm.
when for you did that switch? I assume you've kind of been through it all the way for the most part. When did it change where it was like, okay, people are buying a lot of graded cards now, like
Yeah.
instead of raw?
Yeah. For me, it was around 97, 98 when I graduated college. Um, I first saw graded cards at a show in Kansas City with my dad. And that was before I graduated, and I didn't know what they were. I thought they were weird. I didn't know why you wouldn't want to touch your own cards, kind of like, what everyone's first impression was. But what happened was I was putting together a 61 Pirate team set, and I saw a photo of a 61 Clemente graded to PSA 8. And I said, man, this card looks really nice. And I saw what they were selling for in these auctions. And so I used When It Was a Game, which was a big scammer company that turned out to be later on. But in their telephone auction, you had to call in the bid. I won a 61 Clemente PSA 8. I paid like $300 for it. I remember what the
Wow.
price was. In 90s, like in 99, around 97, closer to 97. $300, which was a lot of money then. Most I ever paid for a card, at that time. My dad thought I was crazy. We got it, opened it up, and then we both were just like in awe. Like, how is this not a 10? This card looks so nice compared to every vintage card I ever owned. And then from then on, I was like, well, this is the future. Like, everyone's going to want to buy cards graded because they're guaranteed to be this nice.
When you
And
bought it, was there, so that $300, was that a huge premium over what it was? Or
yeah,
were you like, okay, this is actually like, I feel like it's a good deal? Or were you like,
no,
I'm paying a lot, but it's a great
yeah.
looking card?
No, in fact, we were still going by Beckett prices then. So like Beckett at the time, it was probably like $80,
Yeah.
right?
I
So
always
it
found
was,
the Beckett prices. I'd look at a card and be like 25 cents, and then it was like $5 at the card
yeah,
shop, like,
right. Yeah, it was like, I think it was probably $70, $80 at the time in Beckett. So I paid 3 to 4 times what it was priced at, Beckett, which, was unheard of. We were always 60 to 80% of Beckett prices at a show. That's what you were trying to get cards for. And so just paying that huge premium, but I had just saw what those cards looked like, on websites and other auction houses. And I was just like, well, this is the future. And once I got it in hand, it just convinced me 100%. I fell right into it. And I said, well, now I'm going to put together a 61 graded pirate team set. And I just took off from there. And that's where I really became, a big PSA collector. But believe me, guys, I know PSA's flaws. I've lived through all of it. I've lived through the flaws. I've lived through the issues, the trimming issue. So I'm not going to sit here and say like PSA is the greatest thing in the world. I will say that for the most part, they did allow vintage cards to be bought and sold sight unseen, which was a huge improvement over where we were pre 92, 93.
That makes sense. Yeah. Now, what about kind of SGC, Beckett? How did they fit into it? Like in the late 90s, were you also, well, I guess when did, I'm just trying to think of the timeline. Beckett started in early 2000 grading?
Yeah,
Early
Beckett came out around, I think, 98, 99, right?
Okay.
SGC was first. In SGC, their early subs, I think, say SBC on them. They haven't actually, they changed their grading name at one point. And, they had a different scale. They had the, they had a more kind of more numbers in their scale at one point, and they kind of cleaned that scale up to make it more similar to PSAs. So there was like 92s and 84s and 86 and different numbers in there that they don't use anymore. So old SGC. But the thing with SGC, and I've said this a lot, and I've had a lot of SGC fans really upset with me on my channel about this. SGC at one point in time did not penalize for centering like PSA does. So PSA, if a card is, let's say, 80, 20, 90, 10, it's an OC. So you get the like 7 OC, 9 OC grade. SGC may grade that card a PSA 8, right? They'll give that card a straight grade, and they don't penalize the centering like a PSA would. So when I was going through the early parts of grading in the 90s and early 2000s, if you had a card that was way off center and you sent to SGC, because you could get a higher grade, because at PSA it would get the OC designation, which in PSA's registry drops at 2 grades. So when you go to PSA registry, which was a huge thing about vintage cards at the time, a 9 OC was worth a PSA 7 in the registry from a point standpoint. A 7 OC was the same thing as a 5. But if you sent that 7 OC to SGC and it got an 8, that card, in theory, was worth more money. And so I remember when I was selling or buying on eBay back in the days, I wouldn't even look at SGC cards because 90% of them were off center. And it took SGC changing their grading standards to take that more into account. That made me, like SGC a lot more. But early on, SGC was where off-center cards went to die.
Interesting. Huh. Wow. Yeah. So was there still a lot of like cracking? Oh, you know what I was going to ask you too. So you were talking about this really helped with vintage cards, going back because you could buy them sight unseen. Were people grading modern cards in the late 90s with PSA, or was this mostly a vintage thing? Because like, why would you grade a new card from 98, or whatever?
That's a great question. I think so. My experience on it was this, going to these big shows, TriStar shows, Chicago shows during that time period, people grading modern cards were considered a little kooky. But what was happening was pop counts were very low at the beginning. So when Griffey started getting his upper deck graded from the very beginning, PSA protected that grade, the 10 on the Griffey. So it's very hard to get a Griffey 10 on an upper deck card. So for the very early on, there was only like, let's say 20 10s. So they would sell for big numbers even then. And I think that spurred a lot of people to get their modern cards graded. But the registry for PSA was such a big deal and such a big drug. And then you got to remember, not every card is on the registry. Like you had to petition PSA to add a set or a card to a registry. So if you wanted to collect Jim Brown cards and Jim Brown didn't have a registry, you had to submit a list of every Jim Brown card to PSA. They would decide if they wanted it to be added to the registry. Then you could make a Jim Brown set on PSA's website on their registry. But if there was a registry, like let's say the Hall of Fame rookie card set from any sport, that existed already. And the competition for those cards was fierce. And so that spurred a lot of grading. People would want to grade those Hall of Fame rookie cards because they knew a lot of people were putting together registry sets. But having the higher grades of those cards to do better on the registry, to be the number one, became an obsession by a lot of really rich collectors. So you had this thing of like, well, I need a PSA 10 of every Hall of Fame rookie. And so the competition amongst those really to be number one in that registry set was fierce. And you would see it on even sets like, I remember putting together like Steeler team sets, and people would bid $500 on a common Steeler PSA 10 because they wanted to have the number one Steeler team set on the registry.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it created a ton of grading opportunities. And there's short prints. Like in the 61 Pirate team set, the Joe Gibbon and Pirate team cards are short prints. So those two cards sell for an extreme amount of money in 8, 9, and 10 grade. Like really a lot of money. And when they were even lower pops, you know, that Joe Gibbon card would sometimes sell for $500 to $700 back in the day as a PSA 8. So
Wow.
that's just a 61 common card, but he's a short print high number. Same way with the team card. So again, that exposed what were truly short prints too, because you got to remember there was a lot of myth about this card was a short print. I remember the 65 Lou Brock was supposed to have been a short print. No, it's not. Look at the pop report. But if you look in Beckett, oh, it's a short print. Why? Why was that a short print? It was just thought to be a short print by dealers, but it really wasn't. But then other cards that no one knew was a short print actually turned out to be short prints, like the 62 Frank Robinson is a short print. And you know, it's hard to find in good condition. I say that it's printed, but finding a high grade 62 Frank Robinson, very tough. And no one knew that until grading really started, that some of these cards actually are very hard to find in high grade.
That's really interesting. How do you see it all going? Because now obviously like this thing has morphed into a whole different animal from what it was in the late 90s, especially with kind of the resurgence over the last couple of years. I guess first question would be is, do you think the resurgence over the last couple of years was a blip on the radar and kind of a pandemic, you know, funky black swan event? Or, you know, do you think it actually, you know, there is some legs? You have people like, you know, me, like my age that have gotten back in and plan on staying in. And then also the second part of it is like, do you see PSA just staying number one? I mean, obviously they have capacity, they have, you know, the money behind the company. But there's a lot of companies in the space now. Like, what are your overall thoughts?
Well, I think we're going to have more people in the hobby now than we did, you know, in 2018. That's just a given. And so there is more money involved, and, you know, you add fanatics and these companies, and yeah, there's more money in the space than ever. But you got to understand though, even with those new people coming in, everyone has a budget. So, you know, there is a limit to how much those new people will add money to this space. And not everyone can afford $5,000 and $10,000 cards every day and every week. So I think that's going to put pressure to drive prices down from some of these cards. But there's always hot players in cards. You know, I mentioned O'Neal Cruz. Look at his prices recently, and he's hitting 214. You know, he's a hot prospect. He had a good game when he first came up. Those things always happen. It happened every year I've done collecting. I came back into hardcore prospect collecting with Steven Strasburg and Bryce Harper, right?
He was a beast. And then
they
he had
were
like
beasts,
Tommy
right?
John.
Yep. But he still had a great career. But during that time period, and then you had Mike Trout in 2011. So you had 3 straight years of, you know, Steven Strasburg, Bryce Harper, Mike Trout, you know, just Manny Machado. You had all these guys coming up year after year. That's always going to happen in this space. Same way for rookies in football and basketball. So that always drives people to spend money on those kind of newer rookies. So I do think the hobby is always going to have spikes, but the sustained growth on these base cards that are common, will go back down to levels that make more sense and more reasonable. So a Kobe Bryant rookie card in the tops, or the tops LeBron, will find its natural, you know, level when this is all said and done. That's based on the pop report and how people really like LeBron, because that's not his best card. That's not the most popular card, and it's got a high pop count. So that's going to go down to the natural level. I think we're going to see those things just kind of equilibrate back to where it should be, based on real numbers such as rarity, popularity, and hype. But the hype can't. The thing that happened in 2020 that was very different was the entire hobby got hyped, not just one card, not one player, but it was everything. And that's not sustainable. You can't hype everything all at once and make it sustainable. Like Marvel cards. You know, I collect Marvel cards. I still think there's a lot of great cards out there I need to collect, but you can't have every PMG worth $5,000. You know, that's just unreal. Like, you can't, that's just not sustainable, right? We all kind of knew that, but that's something that you would just use an example. Like, that market will never get that hot ever again. that was sort of a one-time thing. But there's going to be Marvel cards that are going to get hot based on movies, based on the character, whatever. And then those rare cards will probably go up in value. And so that's going to be the more normal flow of the hobby. And that's really what it was like before the COVID 2020 2019 through 2021 time period was. That's, to me, is the natural order of the hobby, and I think that's what we're going to get back to. Sorry, what was your second question? Sorry, it was a little long there.
Well, I guess kind of the grading company wars.
Yeah,
How do you see it? It's obviously like no one has a crystal ball, but just based on the fact that you've been dealing with these companies for 20 years, 20 plus years, what are your thoughts on it? Like, how do you see it going?
I'm kind of concerned about them increasing their capacity to the levels they did, honestly. I don't think that
a lot of pressure on a PSA. I mean, 1 million cards a month. Like, I made a video on it today just about like their price point. Like, their price point's going to have to go down to be able to pay everybody.
Yeah, and I think the idea that people are going to get cards graded on these, like, think about base cards, which were driving a ton of the orders back in the day. If people don't submit those to be graded, even at $10, because it's worth 20, so by the time you do the whole transaction, you're making $5, $3. There's people doing I call it like more microtransaction sales in this hobby. That happens, but again, they were doing it through channels like Check Out My Cards, Slab Stocks, places that had ways to do that easier. With those companies going under, I think those are going. Check Out My Cards isn't going to go anywhere, but some of those other companies have kind of failed. And eBay's not a great place to sell $5, $10 cards. So I think not having a platform to sell those cards is going to be really tough. So I feel like the volume that was swelling into the hobby that they geared up for was that volume. And you're right, unless it gets down to $5 or $10 again, there's no reason to grade those cards because you can't make money on it. And again, there's not enough $5,000, $2,000 cards to handle the volume that they've built up for. So unfortunately, I do see that. I feel like based in the supply chain side of it, they're over capacity and they're going to be underutilized and they're going to have to let people go. And that's unfortunate because I think, that's what's going to happen. And obviously some other companies will probably not make it because there's not going to be enough cards to go around in the future, because again, it has to make sense. Like, people aren't going to grade cards just to grade cards. The reason people graded cards before was they were making money.
Who's going to be the buyer on the other side of it? Because even if it's $5 to grade, you might say like, okay, I've got these base rookie cards of Trevor Lawrence, and hell, for $5, yeah, I'll grade them. But if there's not that demand on the other side, if they're doing 1 million cards a month, if that's the capacity, then there's going to be a heck of a lot of slabs out there in the world. And it's just, is there going to be that buyer on the other end to pay $30, even if it's $30 for that card or whatever it is for you to make $10, will it be there? And maybe it will be, but that's the part that's going to be a question.
I think I would be very scared if I was banking on that in the future for the hobby, if I was PSA, because again, collectors would be smarter just to keep those cards raw and just buy them raw and keep them in their collection, because that micro transaction of a $10 or $15 gain in value over time, when a players, for the most part fail, newer players for the most part fail. And so you're going to hold that card for 5 years and have it be worth less than you paid for. And now it's in a slab. If you just had it in a raw card, you paid a couple bucks for, if it goes up and you make a few bucks on that sale, but if you just keep it, that's a lot more a way to control your risk. And I think people are just going to be like, it's not worth grading these cards because even if this guy ends up being good, this card itself is so common, it's never going to go up to value. But if it's like rare card number to 25 or whatever, get that graded. That makes a lot more sense to do that. So I just don't think these base cards are going to be seeing these numbers again. And again, if you get vintage, the set collecting is already kind of done. There's not going to be tons of new 56 tops being graded. So that side of the hobby is pretty mature. So, vintage grading isn't going to save PSA in this realm. It's going to have to be coming from new cards. And I don't see people just flocking to send new cards to PSA to just to get a slab on them to make, again, those small amounts of money.
It's a good point, because we think like, what did they grade 10 million plus cards over the last 3 years? If you think about where their backlog was and they're kind of getting it wrapped up, I mean, we've been looking at pop reports and kind of making buying decisions based on
Mhm.
pop reports, not really knowing like what's still there to be graded. And but now where they're finally getting to the point where we can actually say like, okay, like we actually have a decent idea of where some of this stuff sits on the supply side, the graded supply.
Yeah. Well, another thing too is, Panini's going to ramp up production massively as they exit this, these sports hobbies. And so, that is something that, is to me a big watch out. For example, these Prism base rookie cards of, Trevor Lawrence and Mac Jones, they're going to be printed into the ground. And that's because, the way supply chains work, it takes a couple months, say 6 months to a year to ramp up and 6 months to a year to ramp down. So we're literally sitting into 18-month window here where they're going to increase production. They're going to pump out tons of product. They're losing these licenses. They don't care. And there's going to just be all these base cards out there, and they're just not going to be really worth anything to grade. And if PSA really thinks, yeah, maybe the first 100 or 2,000 Mac Jones cards get graded, but at some point people are going to just say, there's so many of them, why get them graded? And I think we're going through a period where the hobby is going to make that transition to being like a Prism based card of any rookie card isn't worth getting graded anymore because they print so many of them. At some point when Fanatics takes over, maybe they control that printing to the point where, it doesn't destroy the value of the base rookie. But right now it's printed in the ground. And look at Topps as well. Topps is printing things in the ground too.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right, we're going to shift gears here. Bradley, Brian, do you have any thoughts on a possible Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle resurgence? Like, could any of the trading cards, comics, toys spike in the future? I feel like that franchise is kind of slept on. That's like it's very nostalgic for me. I've got actually the original action figures from 88 or 87, that first year is still in the box. So I'm going to hold on to those just because I think that over time it'll be kind of cool to hold on to them and to see what happens. I might get them graded by AFA, but I don't know. It's kind of one of those. It's popular, obviously, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, obviously, the comic book is probably going to become the most valuable modern comic book of all time, or you can say Bronze Age book, or however you want to say it.
Yeah,
it's going to be the first print. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1 is going to be, the most sought after Bronze Age book ever made. So, from that perspective, it's already achieved some status there. As far as toys, the toys are so cool. I think, again, not being a huge toy collector, but I know that, certain toys are just iconic, and that's one of them, and I think it, to make things popular again, obviously having better media content, the last movie I think wasn't that great. They've rebooted the animated show many times. What I would love to see from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I know they've got the Last Ronin, book out right now, which is a more serious take on the Turtles. I would love to see an animated, serious, like, very emotional, serious take on the Turtles in a cartoon format. I think that could be something amazing because those characters can go super comical or super serious. We haven't seen a super serious version of the Turtles, in my opinion, yet. And I think that would be amazing to take them into an anime serious take and more like a Dark Knight Batman type situation.
Yeah, like the DC,
DC it up, make it dark.
Joker movie or so,
could you? I mean, Shredder could be an ultimate bag. I mean, there's a lot of things there that they could work with. That's what's fun about it, is they could go in a lot of directions, but that would be something I'd like to see because I think it would generate some interest in the characters again because it's not the same thing over and over. I feel like they keep going over the same ground a little bit too much. The Last Ronin, book right now is definitely different, but they don't do that in the other media yet. So that's what they got, I think, to make it really fresh.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree. They've got to kind of mix it up. They definitely have to mix it up for sure. Perk, what's going on? Are you going to the National again this year? Remember, we sat at Card Collector 2's trade night together. That was fun. I'm actually not going to make Card Collector 2's trade night. We should actually shift over to the National next. We should talk about that. I'm coming in Friday at about noontime and then leaving on Sunday morning. So I'm not doing the 5-day marathon type thing. I'm just kind of in and out. But what are your thoughts, Jason, on the national? I guess you didn't go in Chicago last year, right?
No, I did not. So
But you've
last year,
been plenty of times, so.
yeah, I've been, like I try to put a number to it. I was like, I mean, close to 10, times so far. So what I'd say last year was I was working and again, finishing up, school. So I really didn't feel like I had the real bandwidth to go. But I did feel like there was this pressure last year amongst content creators to go. Like, if you didn't go, you were missing out on the greatest event of the hobby history, kind of like of this new hobby, because I think the way it was phrased, in my opinion, on YouTube was the hobby is new. Like, it's got new rules. The way people collect is different. Everything's new. What you did 20 years or 10 years ago doesn't matter anymore. And so this national is going to be this new thing. Soccer F1 is going to be it was just like everything is new. This show is going to show how new it is and how different. And so I felt like there was a lot of pressure to go as a content creator, and I didn't go. And in all honesty, it didn't hurt me, because when you don't get to go to these places because you really want to go, because I just like to do cards and comics. I like to collect. For some reason, last year didn't hurt me when I saw the amount of people. I saw how busy and packed it was. The trade day looked really cool, but other than that, I didn't see anything there where I'm like, well, this seemed like something I really missed out on. I feel like this year, this seems like a more important national to me than last year, because there's a lot of things going on in the hobby, from pricing, from how we collect, to what's going to be there, how dealers are going to be buying. Are they going to be buying? Are they going to be trading? Are they going to be trading down? Are they going to be wanting smaller cards, bigger cards? There's this kind of unknown factor to this national. How is it going to be attended? Is Atlantic City a terrible place to have one? We haven't had one there in a long time. It's just, there's a lot of things about this one that feels like it's new. Like, we don't know what's going to happen. I think last year was a big love fest. Everyone got there, loved each other, hugged each other. It was great. Kind of like, it was almost like the culmination of this new hobby uprising. And then now everything kind of has gone downhill from them from a pricing perspective. This year, it does feel like I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to be a great show, if it's going to be unattended, if there's going to be dealers out there just fire selling, on Sunday, or is it going to be everyone's going to be firm on prices, no trading, cash only? I don't know, but to me, it's going to be fun to go there and figure it out. And again, part of shows that make it fun for me is going there, figuring out what the vibe of the room is, what is feasible to get accomplished, and then working the best deals I can and coming home with something cool. That's why I really like going.
When you go to, well, I guess card shows in general, but definitely the national has got a lot of vintage compared to, it's just like a lot of vintage in one place, where like more so than any other show. Not that I've been to a zillion shows, but I've been to a few big ones now. Do you go with vintage in mind when you're there, or is it more of just you take what the defense gives you? Like, if there's great modern deals, you take modern deals.
Yeah, I mean, I try to roll with the punches, but when I show up to shows, I always bring vintage with me, because that's what I have the most of to trade and sell, in terms of volume and in terms of probably the better content. But when I value things from, how much I want to be firm on prices, always the modern stuff is at a lower percentage in my head than the vintage cards. So I'm going to be firmer on the vintage cards when I go to dealers and try to, move them, trade them, whatever I'm doing, than I am going to be most modern cards. So I already have the hierarchy in my head on how I want to approach it. But for the most part, in the last 2 years, vintage cards from a collector to dealer perspective isn't very common. You don't see a lot of collectors bringing vintage to shows to either sell or trade. It's all been kind of hoarded, in my opinion. I mentioned this a lot on my channel about Willie Mays cards, is that used to, 5 years ago, I could go and almost buy any Willie Mays PSA 8 from any year on eBay every month, every week. Now I can go in there may be 2 or 3 years, there'll be a 68, a 67, and maybe a 70 or a 72, 2 or 3 of them a week. In no 50s, very few 60s Mays for sale. And it's because the collectors don't want to sell them. The dealers are hoarding inventory. And so this national, is that supply chain going to loosen up? Are we going to see collectors selling those cards? Are we going to see dealers trying to sell them at more reasonable prices? That's what I'm looking for, because if they are, I'm going to be there ready to go. And if they're going to hold on to those prices or not making them available, then I'm going to pivot and look at maybe extending my, Native American collection, my pirate PC, whatever it is. I'll pivot and go from there. But my first love is to try to complete my Willie Mays collection, and that's what I'm going to go looking for. But if it's not there, I'm not going to sit down and pay 2 or 3 times what I should for a card just to say I picked one up.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that about the Willie Mays stuff, because I remember at the National last year, there was a dealer that had said that, for every Willie Mays sale I make, I sell 20 mantles, Mickey
Mm-hmm.
mantles. And I remember seeing a lot more mantles at the National. And when you saying that there was like 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, there was all sorts of options. And then it makes you wonder, like, all right, well, is it because the 52 Tops mantle's in the news all the time? And so dealers are like, well, it's mantle's hot. Let's sell the mantle stuff. I mean, I know that's kind of like the GOAT for vintage baseball or whatever, but there was definitely a lot more that I saw. Now, granted, like there's a zillion tables there, so maybe I missed it, but I saw a lot more mantle out than I saw Willie Mays.
Well, and that just shows how the hobby grew in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, right? Mantle was the currency of vintage. So if you wanted the best, 60s and 50s cards, it was always Mantle. Hall of Fame rookie cards sprinkled in there. But that's just how it was. And the deltas between Mantle and Mays were enormous. Like 60 Mantle would be, let's say, in 17, 18, let's say it was, $4,000. Willie Mays is $350. Same grade, PSA 8. I mean, you're talking like 10x multipliers. That's gotten a little closer now. But again, if you're in the high end vintage market, the Mays cards are bringing a couple $100, while the Mantle cards are bringing a couple thousand. So there was no comparison in terms of high end. Mays cards and Aaron cards and Clemente cards were definitely not $1,000 cards for a lot of the 60s and 70s cards. Every Mantle card at one point, for the most part in a PS8 was $500 or up, and so they were all high end. And I think that is how dealers thought about it. So Mantle was alpha and omega. Every other player from the 50s and 60s is just there, like they're the second tier. And I say that on my channel a lot, second tier, third tier, and people get a little upset because I'm like, well, Mantle, Mays, they're kind of first tier 50s Hall of Famers, then second tier is like Ernie Banks, Frank Robinson. They're all great players, but you look at how they're valued, there's definitely a tier in terms of where certain players fall. And, but at one point, Mantle was so far in front of everyone that, of course, if you're a high-end vintage dealer, you're going to focus on the Mantles because that's what people wanted, and that's what was really expensive. And if you had raw cards of Mantle, then you got them graded because they gained you more value. So, but I think it's changed. I really think Mays and Aaron and these other players are gaining in value because if you just look at WAR, for example, Willie Mays, beats Mantle in almost every category from a WAR perspective. And I understand Mantle got hurt, but that's how it goes in sports. Ken Griffey Jr. got hurt, right? Willie Mays had a better career, a longer career, generated more average WAR per year than Mantle, and just had a better career and was a better player. If you had to take both players and their careers and say which one would I pick to start a team with, you're going to start with Mays every time.
What's your take on vintage football and vintage basketball, kind of along those same lines? Because vintage baseball is kind of a mainstay. It's that those were the first cards to be collected. Baseball was kind of the, America's pastime. You have baseball cards, but there's more and more interest, I think, in the vintage football, of course, and then vintage basketball. It's gotten more attention, I would say, over the last couple of years, just because football and basketball modern stuff has become very popular. And so then you have people that are looking back, like, okay, well, what does vintage look like? What is your take on that? Do you think that's kind of more of a fad, just the vintage football, basketball, or do you think it has legs, the same way baseball always has?
No, I mean, so I think that what we're creating right now is the folks who are collecting and going to stay in the bit and stay in the hobby are seeing that if they're, in it long enough, they're seeing that I can get, Roger Staubach and Terry Bradshaw cards super cheap right now from the 70s. I can make my dollar go really far for some of these players that were all-time greats and have cards that look really cool and have some really character to them. And there's value there. And I think as people look for value in the hobby, as they say, well, the modern cards are kind of going down, where can I find value? they're going to land on vintage because that's just how it goes. That's just what happens in the hobby. And I don't think we're going to see those cards going down. I think people are going to try to corner and get those, Jim Brown cards, the Wilt Chamberlain cards, the big time Hall of Fame guys are going to continue to go up. Maybe not 2x, 3x like they did a couple years ago, but they'll continue to rise. You might see, we see a correction right now because they went up so far at once, but there's going to be a floor to when they start growing again. And that's just because those cards are so stable. And if you're going to park money into the hobby, I talk about having a portfolio of cards. You want to have, a majority of your portfolio in those vintage cards. If I was just going to say build a portfolio of sports cards, those vintage Hall of Famers, Hall of Fame rookie cards, those all-time great, vintage cards are where you need to have a lot of your money stored, and then use, the modern players as kind of like your risky bets to grow quick cash or to have kind of your, to do something more fun, call it more recent, but you're going to have a core amount of cards that are going to continue to be stable or grow at a certain rate. Because I just feel like that's where the safe people say that's playing it safe. I say that, those cards and those players are always going to have a huge, fan base, and they're just cool. Like, go look at, those 70s cards. They're just cool looking. They just have cool designs. 65 football is one of the best looking cards ever made. And people forget that there's I forget what year it is but there's a year of hockey where you've got the tall boys, right? Those cards look amazing. 63 Parker's hockey is one of the coolest sets ever made. And so a Gordie Howe from that year should be worth more than $700 or $800, right? He's one of the best players ever. That card looks amazing. So I think people are going to look at those cards and say, I can spend $700 on a Gordie Howe card if I'm a hockey collector, or I can buy one McDavid third tier rookie card. Yeah, I think people are going to make some choices, and some people will always buy the McDavid, but I think you're going to see more and more people say, maybe I should buy one McDavid and one Howe instead of two McDavids. And I think that's where you get the diversification that people will eventually get to. And the one thing I always see is that I see new collectors come into the market, and 3 years later, I see vintage cards on their table. Because it's a natural evolution of the hobby. It's just how things happen.
And I guess that's a good sign for just vintage over the long run anyway. Just as far as like maintaining prices and interest and all that, is like, if you're looking for store of value, you're probably feeling a little bit better about, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Mantle than you are maybe about like Mahomes or some of the new guys that you just never know what could happen. It's interesting.
Yeah. No,
I got a tough question for you. So, and we'll wrap up here. We're at about a minute or hour 12. So we'll wrap up here in a few minutes. But if you had, I'm gonna put you on the spot here. So if you can only pick between Silver Age or Golden Age comics or vintage cards, and that's it, which one would you go with for the long haul? And I guess what would be kind of your thought behind that?
Well, yeah. So it's hard because, I'm
putting you on the spot.
Yeah. So, I think in general, honestly, Golden Age comic books, the right comic books would be the safer, better bets because they have much lower pop reports. If you really get down to it, especially in the highest grades, they exist in teens and 20s, right? There's like so few of them. And so you're talking about characters like Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, Spider-Man Silver Age, but Captain America, these comic book characters are going to live on for generations. Whereas, sometimes the player popularities aren't quite there every year. Some players get more popular. I just feel like in comic book world, some of those comic books are going to get so unattainable that if you had the money to get into them now, just like if you got into them in 1995 with, let's say, a Batman 1 or Action 1 or something like that, you would be sitting with millions of dollars today. To me, that's what I would look at as some of these really key Golden Age comic books are going to be just you can't even find them. I can go to a card show tomorrow or at the National and pick up a Ty Cobb card, pick up a Babe Ruth card. There's going to be multiples of styles and to pick from. If I want, a Batman 1, it's literally like there might be one a year that's sold or two a year, in grade other than maybe 1 or 2 or something like that. If I wanted a high end, so if I had the money and the ability to get high end comic books of those kind of status, that would be where I think that you would make more multiples quicker. From a personal love, obviously, there's parts of sports cards that I don't have that from a collector perspective I would still love to have that I don't in my collection. That would if I had to make that Sophie's choice, it would break my heart to not have those cards. But from a investment perspective, those golden age comic books I think are just going to continue to outpace those cards, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It's just when you compare pop reports on some of that stuff, and honestly, there's just so many more cards. Even when you're looking at vintage, there's just so much more. On the pop reports, at least graded.
Yeah.
than you see on those on the comic book
Well,
side.
and comic books were designed to be read and thrown away. And they were
Yeah.
never designed to survive. A long time. So those golden age books from like the 30s, you got to remember like the 30s is where these are coming from. So they're older than most of these vintage cards, even though the T cards, you got to remember the T cards are very common. Other than the Honus Wagner, there's a ton of Ty Cobb cards and Cy Young cards out there. Compared to look at Action 1, Batman 1, that are in some kind of condition that you could say is mid to high grade. They just don't exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like too, just grading a 30-page comic book over, it's like, it's easier to kind of toy with a little card, trim it, or, or whatever you're going to do. A comic book is kind of tricky. I mean, I understand you can color it up and, do things, but I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure if you're a grader that knows what you're doing, you can pretty easily figure out if something's been restored,
Yes.
with paint and with lighting and different things. So I have to assume those are just tougher grades, those higher end comic books,
Mm-hmm.
but what do I know? All right, guys, I think we are going to wrap up. Jason, thanks very much for coming on. We'll have to definitely do it again.
Yeah, thank you.
A wealth of hobby knowledge. Jason has Cards and Comics YouTube channel. So definitely get over there, subscribe. The thing I like about Jason's channel is he hits on a lot of different topics. He does kind of put out different stuff about various eras of cards and comic books, but then he also tackles interesting topics that a lot of other content creators might not be touching on. So definitely check out the Cards and Comics YouTube. Jason, any other, you have an IG and stuff. Do you want to go ahead and throw that out there?
Yeah. I have an Instagram. I can put it in the chat for you guys. I know I'm bad with my own content. It's like Cards and Comics all spelled out like 17333 or something like that. But I'll put it in there. It's also on my channel. If you want to click on the link there, you'll see it there. But yeah, I just want to say thanks and I appreciate the comments, and come by my channel and leave a comment, and if you guys got ideas for things for me to talk about, you'd like to see from me, let me know. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and we'll definitely do another live stream again for sure. We'll do it. I'd like to do this every couple of months, every quarter. Absolutely, kind of check back in and see what you're up to. So
great, yeah. And if you're going to the national, I'd love to run into you.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, definitely will. All right, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right.